Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Man the Wall. I talk about history, politics, and whatever else I feel like that day. So if you've seen my last few videos, you know I've targeted historical revisionism for Marxist-Leninist content creators. But let it be known that tankies are not the only people we'll be targeting on this channel for engaging in historical revisionism. Because if there's one thing tankies and conservatives have in common, besides a fundamental misunderstanding of socialism, it's defending authoritarian regimes so long as they support their ideal economic system. You see, despite claiming to be defenders of freedom, read unregulated capitalism, conservatives have a long and proud history of supporting authoritarian regimes so long as they serve American geopolitical interests. And today we're going to look at one of the more notable dictatorships many American conservatives have a hard-on for, that being the military junta of Augusto Pinochet in Chile. But first, some background. Chile is a narrow South American country that stretches from the Andes to the Pacific Ocean. It declared independence from Spain in 1815 and established a parliamentary system in 1891. From there, Chile continued its existence as a moderately prosperous democratic country that, unlike many of its neighbors, didn't see much political involvement by the army. That began to change in 1970 when Salvador Allende, a long-standing political figure who had attempted to run previously 3 times, managed to win due to a divided opposition. Allende was a democratic socialist, something that deeply concerned the Nixon administration of the United States, who feared that Chile could revert to communism. Previous to Allende's election, the CIA had sponsored Allende's opposition and attempted to spread propaganda against his government in what became known as the Track 1 policy. In spite of that, he was elected to higher office, and the CIA began fermenting plans for a Track 2 policy, namely to convince the Chilean military that Allende should be removed in a coup. To help cement this, General René Schneider, an apolitical figure who was against any military action against Allende, was assassinated with weapons provided by the CIA. Eventually, with growing opposition against Allende, the military took action, and Allende's democratically elected government was overthrown. Allende shot himself, and Augusto Pinochet assumed power. During his rule, he undertook several neoliberal reforms and oversaw a period of state terror that most famously included helicopters. Lots and lots of helicopters. Eventually, the army distanced themselves from Pinochet, and he was voted out of power in a 1988 plebiscite. Despite this record, there are a lot of conservatives and libertarians who will defend the regime of Augusto Pinochet, and today we're going to look at 2 notable examples of such, that being the Conservapedia article on Mr. Pinochet, and a podcast from American paleo-libertarian commentator Tom Woods entitled, quote-unquote, The Truth About Augusto Pinochet. First, let's take a look at the Conservapedia article. General Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte was a Chilean general who became Chile's head of state, or leader, from 1973 to 1990. He came to power as a member of a council of military leaders after the overthrow of the communist government of President Salvador Allende. Pinochet is credited with restoring the free market and prosperity to Chile after hardship under communism. Leftists hated Pinochet for his conservative policies, to the point of wrongly imprisoning him in England on political charges long after Pinochet had relinquished power. He was ultimately released. Right off the bat, there's a lot to be addressed here, from the fact that Allende was a democratic socialist, not a communist, to the claims that Pinochet's economic policy was all that successful. More on that later. But I want to focus on the last sentence and how it's framed. The article acts as if the reason Pinochet was in prison was merely because some cabal of evil lefties wanted to bring a conservative brother down. This is far from the truth. Pinochet was indicted on an international arrest warrant by Spanish judge Basilter Garzón for crimes against humanity, including the torture of 94 Spanish citizens and the death of Carmela Soria, a Spanish-Chilean diplomat who used his immunity to protect political dissidents that was murdered by DINA, the Chilean secret police, as part of Operation Condor, a deliberate targeting of supposed left-wing sympathizers supported by the United States. A legal battle in the House of Lords ensued, during which former UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher adamantly supported him and even sent him a bottle of malt whiskey of all things, saying, quote-unquote, Scotch is one British institution that will never let you down. Eventually, he was returned to Chile on the basis of his supposedly fragile health, where he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for giving up his position as senator for life. Despite this, a Chilean court removed his immunity in regards to his role in supervising the Caravan of Death, a death squad responsible for killing up to 97 people. Despite this removal initially being suspended due to Pinochet's alleged dementia, in 2004 that status was revoked, and he was further indicted for tax fraud and amassing up to $28 million in, let's say, not very legal terms. Unfortunately, like Slobodan Milosevic the same year, he died of a heart attack before he could be tried for his crimes against humanity. So, yeah, he wasn't wrongly imprisoned. If anything, he got off way too easy given what he did. Quote-unquote, United States intelligence reports implicated the communist Allende in the assassination of several opponents, while the KGB files smuggled out of Russia by the Lazima Troikin indicate that Allende received funds from the Soviet Union. Allende was formally condemned by Chile's parliament for systematically destroying democracy in Chile. The Chilean Chamber of Deputies resolution of August 22, 1973, accused Allende of support of armed groups, torture, illegal arrests, muzzling the press, confiscating private property, and not allowing people to leave the country. In the infamous Cuban packages scandal that precipitated the coup, large quantities of weapons were sent by Castro's Cuba to arm pro-Allende terrorists in Chile. Kissinger privately told Nixon that Allende might declare martial law. Once again, a lot to unwrap. The U.S. intelligence reports, already not a great source given how unbelievably biased the CIA and other American intelligence agencies were against Allende, they cite is just a conversation between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger on the presidential yacht about the death of Edmundo Perez Jucó, an anti-Allende Christian Democrat politician who was assassinated by Chilean anarchist group Vanguard of the People because of his role in the massacre of Puerto Montt, where 10 squatters were murdered by the police. The audio tapes don't say anything about Allende being behind this attack. In fact, Nixon and Kissinger laugh off an accusation made by Allende that the CIA was behind the assassination. As far as the second point, it is true that Allende did receive Soviet funds. However, this only happened after the United States cut off its credits to Chile when Allende planned to nationalize the Chilean copper industry. And on the third point of the Chilean Chamber of Deputies resolution, having read the resolution myself, link in the description, I had to say, it is quite curious that for all the allegations they make against Allende, they've failed to provide any specific examples of the things they alleged actually happening. Given the fact that much of the opposition was A, deeply biased against Allende, and B, had received CIA funding, it wouldn't surprise me if they deeply exaggerated or just made up a lot of these allegations because they didn't like him. As far as the Cuban packages scandal, it is true that weapons were smuggled to Chile by Castro's Cuba as a means of protecting the existing government, but given the way that the opposition acted towards Allende, the foreign pressure being exerted on him, and what ended up happening, I frankly wouldn't blame Allende and his supporters for wanting to be strapped. By 1973, as a result of covert U.S. aid to Chilean dissidents and financing of pro-democracy I'm sorry, let's keep going. U.S. intelligence indicated Allende would likely lose the next Chilean election if it was held. Then why would you overthrow the government in the first place? You know what, never mind, I'm done with these numbnuts. Let's go to Tom Woods. So for the unfamiliar, Tom Woods is a paleo-libertarian, that being a libertarian who holds conservative social principles. Many political scientists, such as Gene Hartsteady, have accused paleo-libertarianism of often entailing quote-unquote explicit racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism. Given the fact that Woods is called the abolitionist, quote-unquote utterly reprehensible agitators who put metaphysical abstractions ahead of prudence, charity, and rationality, yeah, that sounds about right. But strangely enough, in the case of this podcast, Woods actually says very little. Most of the talking occurs on behalf of his guest, Axel Kaiser, a prominent Chilean political scientist. So, yeah, let's see what they have to say.
We were on the verge of a civil war in 1973 when Pinochet took over power, and Allende killed himself. So we were on this Cold War logic, and in the end, the anti-communist forces and anti-totalitarian forces prevailed, which does not justify what happened later, but the country is still divided. You have to keep in mind that Pinochet, after 17 years in government, he had this referendum, yes or no referendum, where he reintroduced democracy, but the question was if he stayed as president with an elected parliament and everything, or he had to go home. He lost, but with 44% of the votes. We don't have to forget that. So he was very popular among the Chilean population, and this is a fact.
First off, I love that this guy describes a movement that overthrew a democratically elected government and established a military junta as being a force for anti-totalitarianism. Second, as far as 44% of the public wanted to keep Pinochet in power before he was forced by geopolitical circumstances, the Cold War was clearly coming to an end, and alienation from within the army to make concessions to the pro-democracy left, well, I mean, Hitler had skyrocketing approval ratings in the first few years of his presidency. That's just not much of an argument. Awful political leaders and movements can be extremely popular amongst large sectors of the population. Just look at figures like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, both authoritarian strongmen who are incredibly popular in their respective countries.
The truth is that Chile was, as most of the world, battlefield, if you want, from in times of the Cold War. So the Soviet Union was actively supporting the Allende regime, and actually Allende was an informant to the KGB. He had been an informant to the KGB since the 1950s. So, and he got a lot of money from the KGB for his own campaign. And it is true, he was elected with 36% of the votes, and in the election of 1970. And what happened was that he brought a Marxist revolutionary program, which he claimed he wanted to install in Chile through democratic means. So Allende was the first Marxist president that was ever democratically elected in the world. And so when Allende was elected, Henry Kissinger said, that this was one of the greatest threats to the Western Hemisphere that had happened, because, of course, this was a very dangerous precedent that a Marxist president could be elected, democratically elected.
So 2 things. 1, the claim that Allende was an informant to the KGB is just flat not true. The only source I could find for this was a book by Christopher Andrew titled The World Was Going Our Way, the KGB and the Battle for the Third World, which states that while Allende did have contact with the KGB, he was never an agent. On top of that, the KGB actively forbade the recruiting of informants from other countries. And secondly, on the issue of Allende posing a threat to the Western Hemisphere, allow me to pose a question, one that may alienate some people watching, but is worth asking anyway. If a people choose to democratically elect a Marxist figure to higher office, what business is it of any other country to interfere with that? The answer is none at all. The decision as to who is the leader of a country is something that should be decided by the people of that country and them alone.
And then no one tells you why Fidel Castro spent a complete month in Chile after Allende was elected. And no one tells you that the Soviet Union was even prepared to send heavy weaponry to the communist cause in Chile. And Pinochet was appointed commander-in-chief by Allende himself. So Pinochet was an enigma from an ideological perspective. And typically, military people are very statist-oriented. They are not, at least in Chile, they are not really free marketeers or something like this.
A few things. As far as the Soviets sending heavy weaponry to the Allende government, well, first off, I don't think we as Americans really have a leg to stand on in that regard, given how much we were involved in the global arms trade. But secondly, given what ended up happening in Chile, I frankly wouldn't really blame the Allende government for wanting some extra guns. As far as the claim that Chilean military people tend to be statist, not pro-free market, well, that certainly wasn't the case with Pinochet, so I don't see how that's relevant. And finally, on the issue of Castro. It is true that in 1971, Castro did make a state visit to Chile, something Allende's opposition ended up using against him. And while, yeah, it probably wasn't the smartest move on Allende's part to invite to Chile the face of Latin American Marxist-Leninism, Castro and Allende were practically night and day. Castro seized power in a violent revolution and established a one-party state. Allende was democratically elected. Castro engaged in vast restrictions to free speech and free press, subjugated LGBT people to re-education and torture, and imposed draconian laws in regards to freedom of movement decades after the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Allende, even under enormous internal and external pressure, never resorted to such barbarities. Castro frequently engaged in imperialist wars both abroad and in his own backyard. Under Allende, the Chilean army never laid a foot on another country's soil. To compare the two is a disgusting revision of the legacy both men leave behind. Granted, these are the kind of people who literally think that socialism is when the government does stuff, so I can't really complain that they don't see the difference.
And the armed forces took over power after they were called by the Chilean parliament. This is something that people don't know.
As far as the Chilean deputies resolution, I've already gone over that. A single claim they made in that document even remotely substantiated, and maybe I'll care. Also, I don't think that the Chilean military coup is made okay just because the parliament said it was. If the Democratic Congress asked the U.S. Army to overthrow Trump in a military coup, would that be okay? As much as I despise that man, I would say no, and I imagine Woods and Kaiser would agree with me. On top of that, if Allende was guilty of any of the crimes they accused him of, why wouldn't you just attempt to impeach him? Maybe it wouldn't work, but you could at least work things out under the rule of law. Unless, of course, you don't actually have any substantive evidence as to why Allende should be removed besides the fact that you don't like him.
Well, you have to look at the numbers. We had 1,000% inflation, year adjusted inflation in 1973. We had scarcity of all basic goods, you name it, from rice to bread to anything you want, meat, whatever, milk. We didn't have these things. We had government was completely bankrupted by these policies of printing money and spending money and all this. Industries were confiscated and they were not working. I don't know any Chilean left-wing economist, serious left-wing economist, who would agree with the statement that Allende had a reasonable economic management of the country. They all have read papers, books, and they all admit that the economic management, the socialist central planned economy that he tried to introduce in Chile was a disaster for the average Chilean person.
So first off, the claim that in 1973 Chile had a 1,000% inflation rate isn't true. It was at 293%. which is still pretty bad, but there are a lot of reasons for that go beyond socialism just doesn't work, bro. A large part of the problem was the decline in exports, which happened in large part because of the decline of the price in copper, in large part because the US refused to import Chilean copper after Allende nationalized the industry. In addition, America also tried to exasperate the situation by backing strikes against the government. As far as the notion that Allende was a complete disaster for the average Chilean, well, that isn't true either. Hyperinflation has always been a problem for Chile, and in the first few years of Allende's presidency, when there was less pressure on him, inflation actually decreased from 36.1% to 22.7%. During his reign, Allende established a minimum wage, attempted to integrate indigenous people into the education system. The subway was remodified to primarily serve working-class neighborhoods. Free milk was established for children. Average real wages increased over most of his presidency. Food was distributed to poor people. A campaign against illiteracy was waged. His government attempted to bring the arts to the wider public. Maternity leave was extended, and tuition-free college was established, which led to an 89% increase in the number of people going to university. Now, was everything Allende did perfect? No, his price controls did weaken overall production, but he made quite a few very serious improvements to the well-being of his country, through democracy no less. So to write off Allende's entire legacy strikes me as a rather dishonest tactic considering his record.
And all these things. And of course, what was the other side's argument? It was that greedy capitalists and CIA agents were taking all the food away, and were leaving people with no basic goods to satisfy their needs. But of course, this is the same nonsense we hear in the Venezuelan case. Of course, you see Maduro saying all the time, "No, this is the fault of capitalists and the U.S. and all these imperialists." And we all know that's nonsense.
Well, there's a pretty big distinction between those two cases, which is that the Venezuelan economy was in freefall long before any sanctions were placed on it by the U.S., whereas the Chilean economy fell apart not too soon after the time the U.S. placed economic sanctions on the Chilean copper industry. So, with all that out of the way, what do they think of Pinochet?
And when he came to power, of course, because the army is the strongest branch of the armed forces, he was elected the president of the junta, because we didn't have a unipersonal dictatorship like Cuba had with Fidel Castro. We had a junta, which means that the commander-in-chief from the four branches of the armed forces were the legislative body, and they were making the decisions together.
So, this argument is completely irrelevant. Whether or not Pinochet ruled as an absolute dictator or as the head of an unelected military junta is irrelevant to me. In both cases, what you have is an authoritarian regime, which, as far as I'm concerned, is completely unacceptable. In our modern society, the notion that a government should function on the basis of consent of the governed should be as accepted and nonpartisan an issue as believing that the earth is round. And the notion that authoritarianism can be justified or excused is a notion I hope to dedicate this channel to challenging.
And of course, when he came to power, the first 2 years, he tried to manage the economy in the way that had been managed the last 50 years. We had this import substitution system, so very protectionist economy and socialist economy, and he failed. So Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger came to Chile in 1975, March, if I'm not mistaken, and they wrote some analysis about the situation of the economy in Chile, and Friedman even met with Pinochet for 45 minutes. And he told him how to correct the inflationary problem and to apply this shock therapy and all this. And so Pinochet listened to them. And because he was a pragmatic and not an ideologue, he applied these reforms and the economy started growing. And that was the origin of the so-called Chilean miracle.
So, at long last, we've come to it. The main argument Pinochet apologists use, the notion that, flawed as he may be, Pinochet dramatically improved the economic conditions of his country. And no. Now, to his credit, the Chilean miracle did see some major improvements to the economy. GDP did increase, and hyperinflation became less of a problem. But at the same time, 48% of the population still lived in poverty, real wages declined, unemployment increased, and income inequality worsened. To this day, Chile has the greatest income inequality of any OECD country, higher than that of Mexico, which is practically an oligarchy at this point. So from a purely macroeconomic stance, yeah, you could argue that Pinochet did some good, but in terms of the way people actually lived their lives, their conditions worsened more than anything. If anything, I think the Chilean miracle serves as more of an example of the failures of neoliberal economic policy than the successes.
That poverty fell from 50% to 7%.
So, again, this isn't true. Poverty was at 48% when Pinochet left office and only began to substantially decrease once he left office, helped by the attempts at poverty reduction by the more left-wing Ruiz-Tagle administration. So, yeah.
I have had several people, libertarians, say to me, whatever good you can say about Pinochet is clearly overwhelmed by the human rights abuses, because it doesn't matter how much he freed markets. If a single person died, it can't be justified. And that's where they leave it. What do you think about that?
I think that's a nonsensical argument. I don't know. I mean, would they rather have a dictator that, besides from human rights abuses, leaves a disaster, like an economic disaster as a legacy? Like would they go for Castro rather than Pinochet? But when you go to Pinochet, who, of course, they were many cases, but let's put the things in perspective. According to the official records of the Chilean democratic government, under Pinochet, 3,000, a little more than 3,000, something more than 3,000 people were killed. 3,000, most of them between 1973 and 1975. The justification for this was fighting against terrorism, Marxism, and all this. Okay. And this is, of course, terrible. It happened. But when it comes to Fidel Castro, according to Project Cuba, it's about 100,000 people. Under Pinochet in Chile, you had many problems. You had organizations that opposed the government. You had political parties that opposed the government. Actually, they came later when he lost the referendum. They came into power. And so you could sell everything you wanted. You could buy anything you wanted. And basically, you were free to pursue your own ends, and with no heavy repression from part of the government. The repression under the Chilean military regime, it existed. Of course, it existed, but was basically focused on groups that the regime thought they were a threat to their power or to the social order. Basically, left-wing groups and left-wing associated people. But the average person was not usually involved in this kind of misconduct or misbehavior or crimes committed by members of the military regime. So when people say to me that nothing justifies the human rights abuses, of course nothing justifies it. But the thing is, you have to be able to do an objective analysis, and history is much more complex than saying nothing justifies something. We had Cold War, the Chilean economy collapsed under Allende, and I have to remind people that Allende was accused by the Chilean parliament of abusing human rights too, of using the police, the secret police, and all these institutions to go after people who opposed the regime. And many people were killed by terrorist groups that were supported by the Allende regime. So this is not a one-sided story. It's not only on the one side that the crimes were committed. It was also from the other side, from the left. Many crimes were committed. And I have to remind people that one of the highest officials of the Socialist Party, the Chilean Socialist Party, Clodomiro Almeida, he was speaking about more than 1 million people that had to die in Chile in order to make the socialist revolution work. These were the terms that they were speaking at the time.
So, a lot of things. First of all, I think this pretty solidly proves, once and for all, that ANCAPs care more about preserving capitalism than they do liberty or democracy, but we all knew that, so whatever. But more than anything, I think this part of the video illustrates the similarity between conservative and tanky authoritarian apologists. I don't universally believe in horseshoe theory, but I do believe there are times when it does apply, and this is one of them. Take, for example, the use of the death toll of Castro to downplay the crimes of Pinochet. I've seen tankies make similar arguments downplaying the crimes of their failed state capitalist experiments by saying that capitalism killed more people. In both cases, it's irrelevant, because thousands of people died either way, and that's unacceptable. As far as the notion that the only people targeted for political detention and torture were leftists, I've seen tankies make similar arguments saying that the only people their states targeted for political detention and torture were bourgeois capitalists. In both cases, it's irrelevant, as to simply quote Dr. King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Finally, as far as the supposed crimes of Allende, well, for one, Chile didn't have secret police until Pinochet showed up, and I love how he's not able to bring up any specific example of anyone Allende actually killed. As far as Almeida, well, the Chilean Socialist Party didn't kill 1 million people, but Pinochet killed 3,000. Before I end the video, I want to mention Pinochet's crimes. In America and many parts of the world, Pinochet's crimes have kind of been boiled down and amassed into one gigantic helicopter meme. And that's a shame, because this was a man whose crimes deserved to be remembered. This was a man who enforced state-sponsored torture of up to 40,000 people via the DINA, the secret police. These included, but were not limited to, La Polita, which is when you are stripped and given electric shock while tied to a metal board, beatings, running over people's legs with large vehicles, licking dirt off floors, being dunked in excrements, waterboarding, and horrific sexual abuse, with some camps being entirely set up as a means of sexually torturing political dissidents, and many women report being raped with animals ranging from trained dogs to rats. Yes, really. In addition, his regime was marked with what many analysts have described as a politicide, with thousands of leftists being killed or disappeared within the course of the first few months of the regime, and groups like the Caravan of Death being ordered to target and execute members of the Popular Unity Coalition Allende had once led. Pinochet was a criminal and a monster, and the fact that he didn't live long enough to face justice for the crimes he committed is genuinely infuriating and sickening. Of course, I don't think Tom Woods and Axel Kaiser care about that, because both of them are fascist scum who care more about protecting their precious economic system than they are in the lives and well-being of people. Oh yeah, and half the comments are about how great it was that Pinochet threw leftists out of helicopters, as if I even needed to say that. I'm Man the Wall, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.